The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the grand ballroom as Victoria Sterling's voice cut through the elegant murmur of Chicago's medical elite like a scalpel through silk. "Well, isn't this precious?" she announced to our table of distinguished donors, her champagne flute raised in mock celebration. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, Amanda finally gets to play dress-up with the real philanthropists. Tell me, darling, how much of Nathan's grant money did you spend on that gown?" The laughter that followed felt like ice water in my veins, but what came next would change. Everything forever. The Northwestern Medical Research Institute's annual charity gala was supposed to be my moment of triumph. After 3 years of marriage to Dr. Nathan Cross, one of the country's most promising cancer researchers, I had finally been invited to sit at the patrons' table, the exclusive circle of major donors who funded groundbreaking medical discoveries that saved lives across the globe. The invitation had arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, addressed to Dr. and Mrs. Nathan Cross, and I had stared at it for nearly an hour, tracing my fingers over the elegant script that finally, officially, recognized me as worthy of inclusion in Nathan's professional world. The months leading up to this evening had been a whirlwind of preparation that went far beyond simply choosing the right dress. I had spent countless hours researching each attendee, memorizing their contributions to medical science, their charitable foundations, their personal interests and achievements. This wasn't just a social gathering. It was my entrance exam into the upper echelons of Chicago's scientific community, where conversations about molecular biology happened over cocktails and million-dollar research grants were discussed between courses of perfectly prepared cuisine. Nathan had been working 18-hour days in his laboratory, pushing toward a breakthrough in immunotherapy treatment that could revolutionize how we approach aggressive cancers. His research focused on engineering immune cells to better recognize and destroy malignant tumors, work that required equipment so expensive and sophisticated that most institutions couldn't even dream of affording it. The pressure on him was immense, not just from the scientific community, but from the knowledge that thousands of patients were waiting for treatments that might emerge from his research. I had chosen my dress carefully, a midnight blue silk gown that was elegant without being ostentatious, expensive enough to belong in this room but not so flashy as to draw unwanted attention to my background. My jewelry was simple: pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and a delicate silver necklace that Nathan had given me for our first anniversary. I wanted to look like I belonged here naturally, not like someone trying too hard to fit into a world that hadn't originally been designed for me. The grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel was a masterpiece of architectural elegance, with soaring ceilings adorned with intricate moldings and crystal chandeliers that had probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Round tables draped in crisp white linens filled the space, each one bearing arrangements of white orchids and baby's breath that released a subtle, expensive fragrance into the air. The stage at the front of the room was set for presentations about the year's research achievements, complete with projection screens that would display complex scientific data to an audience capable of understanding its significance. As we made our way through the reception area, I noticed how naturally Nathan moved through this environment. He shook hands with department heads from prestigious universities, embraced colleagues whose research papers I had read in medical journals, and introduced me with obvious pride to scientists whose work was literally changing the world. "This is my wife, Amanda," he would say, and I would see their eyes assess me quickly. My appearance, my demeanor, my ability to contribute meaningfully to conversations about grant funding and research methodologies. The cocktail hour was a delicate dance of networking and relationship building. I found myself in conversations with Dr. Margaret Whitfield, the evening's host and head of the Research Institute, who possessed the kind of understated authority that came from decades of groundbreaking work in her field. She spoke about the challenges of securing funding for long-term research projects, the frustration of seeing promising studies abandoned due to financial constraints, and the critical importance of private donors who believed in scientific advancement, even when the results might take years to materialize. Standing beside me, Nathan discussed his current project with the kind of passionate intensity that had first attracted me to him. He described the complex process of isolating and modifying T cells, the intricate laboratory procedures required to engineer immune responses, and the careful balance between achieving therapeutic effectiveness and maintaining patient safety. His eyes lit up when he talked about the preliminary results they had achieved, the promising data that suggested they might be approaching a genuine breakthrough in cancer treatment. Victoria Sterling arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that was clearly calculated to draw maximum attention. She swept into the ballroom wearing a red gown that probably cost more than most people's cars, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate updo that showcased diamond earrings large enough to fund a small research project. Victoria was the daughter of a pharmaceutical empire, someone who had inherited not just wealth, but also the social connections that came with generations of involvement in medical philanthropy. She moved through the crowd like royalty, acknowledging her subjects, stopping to air-kiss various dignitaries and pose for photographs that would undoubtedly appear in tomorrow's society pages. When she finally approached our table, I could see Nathan's posture change slightly, not with attraction, but with the kind of careful attention one pays to someone whose approval carries significant weight in professional circles. "Nathan, darling," Victoria said, leaning in to kiss his cheek with theatrical affection. "I've been hearing such exciting things about your research. Daddy says your immunotherapy work might actually be worth the astronomical amounts of money it's consuming." Her laugh was light and musical, but there was something calculating in her eyes as they swept over me, taking in every detail of my appearance and demeanor. The dinner itself was an elaborate affair, with multiple courses designed to impress rather than simply nourish. We began with delicate amuse-bouches that arrived on individual spoons, followed by a soup course that was presented with dramatic flair by servers who poured the broth tableside. The main course featured perfectly prepared beef tenderloin accompanied by seasonal vegetables that had been arranged with artistic precision on each plate. Throughout the meal, conversation flowed around topics that ranged from the latest developments in genetic engineering to the political challenges of securing government funding for medical research. I found myself contributing thoughtfully to discussions about the ethical implications of gene therapy, the importance of ensuring that breakthrough treatments remained accessible to patients regardless of their economic circumstances, and the critical role that private philanthropy played in advancing scientific knowledge. Nathan seemed pleased with how naturally I fit into these conversations, how easily I navigated the complex social dynamics of this gathering. I had spent months preparing for this moment, reading medical journals, attending lectures, and educating myself about the intricacies of his field so that I could be a genuine partner in his professional life rather than simply an attractive accessory. The evening's program began after the main course, with Dr. Whitfield taking the stage to present updates on the various research projects that the Institute was currently funding. She spoke about advances in Alzheimer's research, breakthrough treatments for rare genetic disorders, and innovative approaches to treating autoimmune diseases. Each presentation was accompanied by slides that showed complex data, patient success stories, and projections for future developments. When Nathan's turn came to present his work, I felt a surge of pride as he walked to the podium with quiet confidence. He spoke about the challenges of engineering immune cells that could effectively target cancer while avoiding damage to healthy tissue, the promising results they had achieved in laboratory studies, and their hopes for beginning human trials within the next year. His presentation was clear, compelling, and filled with the kind of technical detail that demonstrated both his expertise and his passion for the work. The applause that followed his presentation was enthusiastic and sustained, with several attendees asking thoughtful questions about methodology, timeline, and potential applications. I could see the respect he commanded in this room, the recognition of his colleagues that he was conducting truly important work that could save countless lives. It was during the dessert course that Victoria chose to make her move, probably emboldened by the wine that had been flowing freely throughout the evening. The conversation at our table had turned to the challenges of funding long-term research projects, the difficulty of convincing donors to invest in work that might not show results for years, and the critical importance of patient private philanthropists who understood the value of supporting scientific advancement. "Speaking of philanthropy," Victoria said, her voice carrying across our table with deliberate clarity, "I think it's wonderful how Nathan has found such an understanding wife. Not everyone would be comfortable being married to someone whose career requires such significant financial investment." Her smile was perfectly practiced, but there was malice lurking behind her perfectly applied makeup. Nathan looked confused by the comment, clearly not understanding the direction Victoria was heading. "Amanda has been incredibly supportive of my work," he said diplomatically, reaching over to squeeze my hand affectionately. "I couldn't ask for a better partner." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, I'm sure she's very supportive. After all, it must be quite comfortable being married to someone with such promising grant funding and research opportunities." "Tell me, Amanda, what did you do before you met Nathan? I don't recall hearing about your background in medical philanthropy." The question hung in the air like poison gas, and I could feel the attention of everyone at our table shifting toward me. This was the moment Victoria had been building toward all evening, the opportunity to publicly question my motivations for marrying Nathan, to suggest that I was nothing more than an opportunistic gold digger who had attached myself to a successful man for financial gain. I had faced subtle versions of this question before, whispered conversations and knowing looks from people who assumed that my marriage to Nathan was based on his professional success, rather than genuine love and partnership. But Victoria was making the accusation publicly in front of people whose opinions mattered enormously to Nathan's career, with the kind of calculated cruelty that was designed to humiliate and diminish me. "I work in nonprofit administration," I replied calmly, though my heart was pounding against my ribs. "I've spent most of my career helping organizations maximize their impact through strategic funding and operational efficiency." It was a diplomatic answer that conveyed competence without providing the specific details that Victoria was clearly fishing for. But Victoria wasn't satisfied with diplomacy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "How fascinating," she said, her tone dripping with false enthusiasm. "And I suppose that background gave you quite an appreciation for the financial opportunities available to the wives of successful researchers. It must be such a relief to have found someone whose work is so well funded." The insult was delivered with such practiced elegance that it took a moment for its full impact to register. Victoria was essentially calling me a gold digger in front of Chicago's medical elite, suggesting that my marriage to Nathan was motivated by greed rather than love, that I was nothing more than a calculating woman who had targeted a successful man for his financial prospects. Nathan's face flushed red, and I could see him struggling to process what Victoria had just said. Dr. Whitfield looked genuinely shocked, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth as she stared at Victoria with obvious disapproval. The other guests at our table shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly uncertain about how to respond to such a blatant attack. "Victoria, that's completely inappropriate," Nathan began, his voice tight with anger and embarrassment. But Victoria cut him off with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand, her attention focused entirely on me, as if she was a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, Nathan," she said with false lightness. "I'm sure Amanda understands that people talk. When someone with no apparent connection to medical research suddenly appears as the wife of one of our most promising young scientists, well, it does raise certain questions about motivation." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to maximize damage and humiliation. Victoria had waited until the perfect moment, when I was surrounded by people whose respect I desperately wanted to earn, when Nathan's professional reputation was also at stake, when any emotional response from me would be witnessed by the very community I was trying to join. But as I sat there, feeling the weight of every gaze at our table, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing shame and devastation that Victoria was clearly expecting, I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. Because Victoria Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. She had assumed that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a woman with no power, no resources, no ability to fight back against her calculated cruelty. She had no idea that for the past 2 years, I had been the anonymous donor whose contributions had funded Nathan's research. She didn't know that the equipment he used, the laboratory space he worked in, and the research assistants who helped him were all made possible by my family's foundation. She couldn't have imagined that the woman she was publicly humiliating as a gold digger was actually the financial backbone that had made her husband's groundbreaking work possible. As Victoria's laughter echoed across our table and the uncomfortable silence stretched like a chasm between us, I realized that the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for had finally arrived. Not the moment to defend myself against accusations that were based on ignorance and malice, but the moment to reveal a truth that would fundamentally change how everyone in this room understood my place in Nathan's life and in the broader world of medical research. The crystal chandeliers continued to cast their dancing shadows across the ballroom, but everything had shifted. Victoria Sterling thought she had just delivered a devastating blow to an unsuspecting victim. Instead, she had just given me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly how wrong assumptions could be when they were based on prejudice rather than fact. I reached for my purse with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, my fingers finding the small leather portfolio that contained documents I had never planned to share publicly. Tonight, in front of Chicago's medical elite, Victoria Sterling was about to learn that sometimes the person you underestimate is actually the person who holds all the power. The evening was about to take a turn that none of them would ever forget. The humiliation at the charity gala wasn't the beginning of Victoria Sterling's campaign against me. It was simply the most public explosion of resentment that had been building for months, like pressure in a fault line that finally triggers an earthquake. As I sat in that ballroom, surrounded by the shocked faces of Chicago's medical elite, my mind drifted back to the first time I had encountered Victoria's particular brand of venom, and I realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day Nathan and I announced our engagement. It had started 3 years earlier, at a faculty mixer held in the gardens behind the Northwestern Medical Research Institute. The event was designed to welcome new researchers and introduce their families to the broader academic community. Nathan had been nervous about bringing me, not because he was ashamed of our relationship, but because he knew how insular and judgmental the medical research world could be toward outsiders. He had warned me that some of his colleagues might be skeptical of anyone who didn't possess advanced degrees in scientific fields, that there was an unspoken hierarchy in academic medicine that could be difficult to navigate. I had dressed carefully for that first event, choosing a simple black dress that was professional without being formal, hoping to strike the right balance between fitting in and not trying too hard. Nathan held my hand as we walked through the gardens, pointing out various department heads and explaining the complex relationships between different research groups. He introduced me to Dr. Whitfield, who was gracious and welcoming, asking thoughtful questions about my work in nonprofit administration and expressing genuine interest in my background. Victoria had appeared like a storm cloud on a clear day, sweeping across the garden with an entourage of younger researchers who seemed to orbit around her like planets around the sun. She was stunning in the way that only truly wealthy women can be, with the kind of polished perfection that comes from a lifetime of professional styling and unlimited resources. Her dress was clearly designer, her jewelry sparkled with the unmistakable fire of genuine diamonds, and her confidence radiated the particular assurance of someone who had never been told that she didn't belong anywhere. Nathan Cross, she had called out, her voice carrying across the garden with theatrical warmth. "I've been hearing such interesting things about your recent research developments." She approached us with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, her smile bright and practiced as she air-kissed Nathan's cheeks with European-style affection. When Nathan introduced me as his fiancé, Victoria's smile had frozen for just a fraction of a second. It was such a brief moment that anyone else might have missed it. But I had spent years reading people's reactions in professional settings, and I caught the flash of something cold and calculating that crossed her features before her practiced charm reasserted itself. "How wonderful," she had said, extending a perfectly manicured hand toward me. "I'm Victoria Sterling. I've known Nathan since he started his fellowship here. We've worked together on several research initiatives." Her handshake was firm, but brief, and her eyes assessed me with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for laboratory specimens. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in subtle interrogation, disguised as friendly interest. Victoria asked about my educational background, my career history, my family's connection to Chicago, and my understanding of Nathan's research work. Each question was delivered with a warm smile and apparent genuine curiosity, but I could feel the underlying agenda behind her inquiries. She was gathering intelligence, trying to determine whether I was worthy of joining their exclusive circle. When I mentioned that I had attended Northwestern University for my undergraduate degree, Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "How interesting that you both have connections to Northwestern. Such a small world, isn't it? And what did you study there?" When I explained that my degree was in business administration with a focus on nonprofit management, her smile became even more practiced and less genuine. "Business administration," she repeated, as if tasting something mildly distasteful. "How practical." I suppose that's quite different from Nathan's background in molecular biology and immunology. It must be fascinating for you to learn about his work. The implication was clear. I was an outsider looking in, someone who could never truly understand or contribute to Nathan's professional world. Nathan, bless him, had tried to redirect the conversation toward more neutral territory, but Victoria wasn't finished with her assessment. She asked about my family's background, whether my parents were involved in academic or medical fields, and what had drawn me to nonprofit work. Each question felt like a probe designed to uncover some fundamental inadequacy that would justify her obvious skepticism about my relationship with Nathan. The evening had continued in that vein, with Victoria inserting herself into our conversations, with other faculty members, subtly steering discussions toward topics that highlighted my outsider status. When Dr. Whitfield mentioned a recent breakthrough in gene therapy, Victoria had turned to me with false brightness and asked, "Amanda, what's your take on the ethical implications of genetic modification? I imagine your business background gives you a unique perspective on the commercial applications." It was a trap disguised as inclusion, designed to expose my lack of deep scientific knowledge in front of people whose respect Nathan needed. But I had done my homework, spending weeks reading medical journals and research papers to prepare for exactly these kinds of conversations. I responded with a thoughtful analysis of the balance between innovation and accessibility, the importance of ensuring that breakthrough treatments remained available to patients regardless of their economic circumstances, and the role that nonprofit organizations could play in bridging the gap between research and implementation. Victoria's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly as I spoke, her practiced smile becoming slightly strained as she realized that I wasn't going to be as easy to dismiss as she had anticipated. But rather than acknowledging that her assumptions had been wrong, she simply adjusted her strategy, moving from direct confrontation to subtle undermining. Over the following months, as Nathan and I planned our wedding and I began attending more academic events, Victoria's campaign against me became more sophisticated and more damaging. She would arrive at gatherings with carefully researched talking points about the latest developments in Nathan's field, then engage him in highly technical discussions that were clearly designed to exclude me from the conversation. When I tried to contribute, she would respond with the kind of condescending patience usually reserved for children who didn't understand adult conversations. At one particularly memorable dinner party hosted by a department head, Victoria had spent an entire evening discussing the intricacies of T-cell engineering with Nathan while I sat beside them, effectively invisible. Every time I attempted to join the conversation, she would acknowledge my comment with a brief nod before immediately steering the discussion back to technical details that required advanced degrees to fully comprehend. By the end of the evening, I felt like a piece of furniture that happened to be sitting in Nathan's chair. But it was the subtle comments to other people that did the most damage to my reputation within Nathan's professional circle. Victoria had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, the concerned observation, and the innocent question that planted seeds of doubt about my motivations and qualifications. She would approach mutual acquaintances at conferences and mention how interesting it was that Nathan had chosen someone from such a different background, how challenging it must be for me to understand his work, and how fortunate I was to have found someone so successful in his field. These comments were always delivered with apparent concern for my well-being or admiration for Nathan's charitable nature in taking on someone who needed so much guidance. But the underlying message was always the same. I was an outsider, a burden, someone who was taking advantage of Nathan's kindness and success for my own benefit. The worst part was that Nathan remained largely oblivious to Victoria's campaign against me. When I tried to explain the subtle ways she was undermining my credibility and making me feel unwelcome, he would dismiss my concerns as overthinking or misinterpretation. "Victoria can be a little intense," he would say, "but she's been incredibly supportive of my research. She's just passionate about the work." He couldn't see what I saw because Victoria was careful never to display her hostility when he was paying attention. She would wait until he was engaged in conversation with someone else, or excused to take a phone call, or distracted by his own professional obligations. Then she would strike with surgical precision, delivering her verbal cuts when there were no witnesses who mattered, when it was just her word against mine. The engagement party had been particularly brutal. Victoria arrived bearing an expensive gift and wearing a smile that could have powered half of Chicago. But she spent the entire evening systematically working through our guest list, planting doubts about my suitability as a partner for someone of Nathan's caliber. She spoke to his colleagues about the challenges of mixed relationships between academics and business people, to his family about the importance of finding someone who truly understood the demands of medical research, and to our mutual friends about the risks of marrying someone from such a different social and educational background. By the end of the evening, I could feel the shift in how people were looking at me. Where there had been genuine warmth and congratulations earlier, now there were polite smiles and careful questions about how I planned to support Nathan's career, whether I understood the financial pressures of academic research, and what role I expected to play in his professional life. Victoria's masterpiece came during the toast portion of the evening, when she stood up with champagne flute in hand and delivered what sounded like a beautiful tribute to Nathan's achievements and our upcoming marriage. She spoke eloquently about his groundbreaking research, his dedication to saving lives, and his bright future in medical science. Then, with perfect timing and devastating subtlety, she turned her attention to me. "And Amanda," she said, her voice warm with apparent affection, "I know you'll be such a wonderful support system for Nathan as he continues his important work. It takes a special kind of person to understand the demands of medical research. The long hours, the financial pressures, the uncertainty of grant funding. But I'm sure you'll learn to navigate all of that." She paused for effect, her smile radiant as she delivered the killing blow. "After all, love conquers all, doesn't it? Even the most challenging differences in background and understanding." The words themselves were innocuous, even supportive on the surface. But the subtext was clear to everyone in the room. I was an outsider who didn't understand Nathan's world, someone who would need to learn how to be worthy of him, a person whose love might not be enough to overcome our fundamental incompatibility. Victoria had managed to publicly question my suitability as Nathan's partner while appearing to offer her blessing, and the applause that followed her toast felt hollow and uncomfortable. Nathan had squeezed my hand and whispered that Victoria's speech was a bit dramatic, but well-intentioned, completely missing the calculated cruelty that everyone else in the room had witnessed. That night, lying beside him as he slept peacefully, I realized that I was fighting a war that only one side acknowledged was happening. The pattern continued throughout our first year of marriage, with Victoria inserting herself into our social and professional lives like a virus that couldn't be eliminated. She would volunteer to organize gatherings that I wouldn't be invited to, suggest dinner parties that mysteriously didn't include spouses, and coordinate professional trips that left me behind while she traveled with Nathan to conferences and research symposiums. When Nathan received a significant research grant 6 months after our wedding, Victoria was among the first to congratulate him, and she made sure everyone knew that she had been instrumental in connecting him with the funding organization. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the funding organization was actually a subsidiary of my family's foundation, and that I had been quietly directing resources toward Nathan's research since before we were even engaged. The Parker Foundation had been established by my grandfather, who had built a successful technology company and dedicated his later years to supporting medical research and educational initiatives. When he passed away, control of the foundation had transferred to my father, and eventually to me as the only grandchild interested in continuing the family's philanthropic legacy. The foundation's assets were substantial enough to fund multiple research projects simultaneously, but we had always maintained strict anonymity in our giving, believing that the focus should remain on the science rather than the donors. I had first learned about Nathan's research through academic papers published in medical journals long before we met. His work on immunotherapy was exactly the kind of innovative, potentially life-saving research that my grandfather had envisioned when he established the foundation. When we began dating, and I learned more about the financial challenges facing his laboratory, I had quietly arranged for the foundation to begin supporting his work through a series of anonymous grants and equipment donations. Nathan believed that his funding came through traditional academic channels, grants awarded by government agencies and medical organizations based on the merit of his research proposals. He had no idea that many of his resources actually originated from the Parker Foundation, filtered through a carefully constructed network of intermediary organizations that preserved our anonymity while ensuring that promising research received the support it needed. The irony was exquisite and deeply painful. Victoria Sterling was building her reputation as a champion of medical research, partly by taking credit for connecting Nathan with funding that actually came from the woman she was publicly dismissing as a gold digger. She was positioning herself as his professional advocate while systematically undermining his wife, never realizing that she was attacking the very person who had made his success possible. As the months passed and Victoria's campaign against me intensified, I found myself carrying the weight of this secret like a stone in my chest. Every time she made a cutting comment about my lack of contribution to Nathan's career, every time she suggested that I was simply along for the ride while he achieved greatness, every time she positioned herself as his true intellectual partner while casting me as decorative baggage, I wanted to reveal the truth that would shatter her carefully constructed narrative. But maintaining the foundation's anonymity was a core principle that went beyond my personal feelings about Victoria Sterling. The moment we revealed our involvement in Nathan's funding, every relationship he had built in the academic world would be called into question. His colleagues would wonder whether his grants were awarded based on merit or marriage, whether his research achievements were genuine or simply the result of preferential treatment. The revelation would taint not just his reputation, but potentially the credibility of his scientific work. So I endured Victoria's attacks in silence, watching her build her status in Nathan's professional circle while systematically tearing down mine. I attended faculty dinners where she would hold court discussing research developments that my foundation had funded, listened to her give presentations about the importance of private philanthropy in medical science while she worked to exclude me from the very community my family was supporting, and smiled politely when she took credit for connecting Nathan with opportunities that I had actually created. The breaking point had come 3 months before the charity gala, at a research symposium where Nathan was presenting preliminary results from his latest study. The auditorium was packed with medical professionals from across the country, and Nathan's presentation was scheduled as one of the keynote addresses. I had been looking forward to this moment for months, proud to see him share the groundbreaking work that our foundation had helped make possible. Victoria had positioned herself in the front row, taking notes and asking sophisticated questions during the Q&A session that followed Nathan's presentation. After the formal program ended, she had held an impromptu reception in the lobby, gathering colleagues around her as she analyzed the implications of Nathan's research and speculated about future funding opportunities. I had approached the group hoping to join the conversation, but Victoria had smoothly redirected the discussion toward technical details that required advanced scientific training to fully understand. When I attempted to contribute an observation about the potential applications of Nathan's work, Victoria had smiled patronizingly and said, "That's an interesting perspective, Amanda. It's always helpful to hear how research might look from a layperson's point of view." The comment had been delivered with such apparent kindness that no one else recognized it as the devastating put-down it actually was. But the message was clear. I was a layperson, an outsider, someone whose opinions carried no weight in discussions about serious scientific work. The fact that the research being discussed had been made possible by my family's financial support was irrelevant, because Victoria had decided that I was fundamentally unqualified to participate in these conversations. That night, alone in our hotel room while Nathan attended a private dinner for senior researchers, I had made the decision that would ultimately lead to this moment at the charity gala. I called Dr. Whitfield and requested a private meeting to discuss my family's potential interest in supporting the Institute's work. I didn't reveal the Foundation's existing involvement in Nathan's research, but I laid the groundwork for what would eventually become a much more public relationship between the Parker Foundation and the medical research community. The meeting with Dr. Whitfield had been revelatory in ways I hadn't expected. She spoke candidly about the challenges facing medical research, the constant struggle to secure adequate funding, and the critical importance of private philanthropy in advancing scientific knowledge. When I mentioned my family's foundation and our interest in supporting innovative research, her entire demeanor shifted from polite professional courtesy to genuine excitement and respect. "The Parker Foundation," she had said, her eyes widening with recognition. "You're talking about the Parker Foundation that funded the Morrison Cancer Center's expansion and the breakthrough research in genetic therapy at Johns Hopkins?" When I confirmed that we were indeed that Parker Foundation, Dr. Whitfield's expression transformed completely. Suddenly, I wasn't just Nathan's wife or an outsider trying to understand medical research. I was a representative of one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in the country, someone whose family had contributed millions of dollars to advancing medical science and saving lives. The conversation that followed lasted for 3 hours, covering everything from current research priorities to long-term strategic planning for the Institute's future. For the first time in my marriage, I was being treated as a serious player in the medical research community rather than a decorative appendage to Nathan's career. Dr. Whitfield asked for my opinions on funding priorities, my assessment of different research approaches, and my thoughts on how private foundations could most effectively support scientific advancement. She spoke to me as an equal, someone whose judgment and resources were valuable contributions to their shared mission. That meeting had planted the seeds for tonight's revelation, but it had also crystallized my understanding of just how completely Victoria Sterling had misjudged both my background and my capabilities. She had spent months positioning herself as the sophisticated insider while dismissing me as an ignorant outsider. never realizing that my family's foundation had probably contributed more to medical research than everyone in Nathan's department combined. As I sat at the charity gala, listening to Victoria's latest attack on my character and motivation, I realized that the time for quiet anonymity had finally passed. Victoria Sterling had just made the mistake of publicly humiliating someone who possessed both the resources and the documentation to prove exactly how wrong her assumptions had been. The woman she was dismissing as a gold digger was actually the financial backbone supporting some of the most important medical research being conducted in the country. The leather portfolio in my purse contained letters from research institutions across the globe thanking the Parker Foundation for funding that had led to breakthrough treatments and saved countless lives. It held documentation of grants and donations totaling millions of dollars, equipment purchases that had enabled scientific discoveries, and scholarship programs that had trained the next generation of medical researchers. But most importantly, it contained the detailed records of the Parker Foundation's support for Nathan's research, including the anonymous grants that had funded his laboratory, the equipment donations that had made his experiments possible, and the fellowship programs that had attracted the brilliant research assistants who helped him achieve his groundbreaking results. Victoria Sterling thought she had just delivered a devastating blow to an unsuspecting victim. Instead, she had given me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that sometimes the person you underestimate is actually the person who holds all the power. The evening was about to take a turn that would forever change how everyone in this room understood my place in the world of medical research. And Victoria Sterling was about to learn that assumptions based on prejudice and privilege could be not just wrong, but spectacularly, publicly, and irrevocably wrong. The decision to compile evidence of the Parker Foundation's involvement in Nathan's research hadn't been made lightly or in haste. It had begun 6 months before the charity gala, on a gray Tuesday morning when I found myself sitting in my father's study, surrounded by decades of philanthropic records and trying to understand exactly how much of Nathan's success could be traced back to our family's quiet financial support. The study itself was a testament to my grandfather's commitment to medical advancement. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held medical journals dating back 40 years, research papers that had been personally signed by Nobel Prize winners, and bound volumes documenting every grant the Parker Foundation had awarded since its establishment. The mahogany desk where my grandfather had made decisions that affected thousands of lives still bore the worn spots where his hands had rested during long hours of reviewing funding proposals and evaluating research priorities. I had called in sick to my job that morning, something I rarely did, but I needed uninterrupted time to trace the complex web of financial relationships that connected my family's foundation to Nathan's career. What I discovered over the next 8 hours of careful research was both more extensive and more significant than I had realized during the years when I was simply approving routine funding requests without paying attention to their ultimate destinations. The Parker Foundation's first involvement in Nathan's research had actually predated our relationship by 2 years. His initial grant application had crossed my desk during my first month as the Foundation's director, a position I had inherited when my father decided to focus on his law practice and leave the philanthropic work to the next generation. The application was for basic equipment funding to establish a new immunotherapy research laboratory, and while the request was modest by Foundation standards, the potential applications of his proposed research were extraordinary. Nathan's grant proposal had been written with the kind of passionate precision that immediately distinguished serious researchers from those simply seeking easy funding. He didn't just describe what he wanted to study. He painted a compelling picture of how engineering immune cells could revolutionize cancer treatment, potentially saving millions of lives while reducing the devastating side effects of traditional chemotherapy. His preliminary research showed genuine promise, and his academic credentials were impeccable. But what had really captured my attention was a handwritten note attached to his formal proposal. In it, Nathan explained that he had been working on immunotherapy concepts during his fellowship, but lacked the specialized equipment needed to move from theoretical research to practical experimentation. He wrote about patients he had met during his clinical rotations, people fighting aggressive cancers who might benefit from treatments that didn't yet exist, and his determination to contribute to research that could give them hope. The note was personal in a way that formal grant applications rarely were, revealing not just a brilliant scientific mind, but also a deeply compassionate person who understood that research statistics represented real human lives. I had approved his funding request that same day, authorizing the purchase of flow cytometers, cell culture systems, and specialized laboratory equipment that would allow him to begin the work that would eventually define his career. Over the following months, as Nathan's research progressed and showed increasing promise, the Foundation had provided additional support through a carefully orchestrated series of grants and donations. We funded his research assistants, provided resources for conference presentations, and supported the expansion of his laboratory space when his initial work area became inadequate for the scope of his experiments. The Foundation's involvement had been structured to appear as if the funding came from multiple sources, a standard practice designed to prevent any single research project from becoming overly dependent on one donor. Grant money was distributed through intermediary organizations. Equipment donations were processed through medical supply companies that worked with multiple foundations, and fellowship funding was administered by academic institutions that managed resources from various philanthropic sources. From Nathan's perspective, his research was being supported by the broader medical community through traditional academic channels. He had no way of knowing that the National Medical Research Alliance was actually a subsidiary of the Parker Foundation, or that the Midwest Cancer Research Initiative was simply another name we used when distributing resources to institutions in the Chicago area. This complex funding structure had been developed by my grandfather, who believed strongly that philanthropic support should enhance rather than overshadow the work being funded. He had seen too many promising researchers become more focused on maintaining donor relationships than advancing their scientific work, and he was determined that Parker Foundation funding would allow researchers to concentrate entirely on their experiments and discoveries. But as I sat in that study, reviewing years of financial records and grant documentation, I realized that our careful anonymity had created an unintended consequence. Nathan genuinely believed that his research success was entirely the result of his own merit and hard work, which was certainly true in terms of the scientific achievements, but incomplete when it came to understanding the financial foundation that had made those achievements possible. The numbers were staggering when I finally calculated the total amount of Parker Foundation resources that had been directed toward Nathan's research over the past 5 years. Equipment purchases totaled nearly $2 million, including specialized instruments that were essential for his immunotherapy work, but far beyond the budget of most university laboratories. Research assistant salaries had consumed another $1.5 million, allowing Nathan to attract the most talented graduate students and postdoctoral researchers in his field. Conference travel, publication costs, laboratory supplies, and facility improvements brought the total Parker Foundation investment in Nathan's research to just over $4 million. It was a substantial commitment by any measure, representing one of the largest ongoing research grants in the Foundation's history. But the results had been proportionally impressive, with Nathan's work producing breakthrough discoveries that were already being implemented in clinical trials at major cancer centers. The irony was devastating when I considered Victoria Sterling's campaign to portray me as someone taking advantage of Nathan's success for personal gain. While she was positioning herself as his professional advocate and dismissing me as dead, the reality was that my family's foundation had provided the financial foundation that made his achievements possible. She was literally taking credit for facilitating research that I had been funding anonymously for years. But gathering this evidence was only the first step in what I realized would need to be a carefully planned campaign to document the full scope of the Parker Foundation's involvement in the medical research community. If I was going to reveal our connection to Nathan's work, I needed to be prepared to demonstrate that our foundation was a serious, respected player in medical philanthropy, rather than simply a wealthy family's hobby project. The next several months had been spent collecting letters, documentation, and testimonials from research institutions across the country that had benefited from Parker Foundation funding. I reached out to former grant recipients, requesting updates on their research progress and permission to use their success stories in foundation materials. I compiled lists of medical breakthroughs that had been enabled by our funding, lives that had been saved by treatments developed with our support, and academic careers that had been launched through our fellowship programs. Dr. Sarah Chen at the University of California had written a particularly compelling testimonial about how Parker Foundation funding had allowed her team to develop a new treatment for pediatric leukemia that had improved survival rates by 30%. Dr. Michael Rodriguez at Johns Hopkins had documented how our equipment donations had enabled breakthrough research into genetic therapies for rare diseases that affected fewer than 1,000 patients worldwide, but had previously received little research attention. The Memorial Cancer Center at Northwestern had been entirely funded by a Parker Foundation grant, providing specialized treatment facilities that had served over 10,000 patients in its first 3 years of operation. The fellowship program we had established at Harvard Medical School had trained 42 researchers who had gone on to lead their own groundbreaking studies at institutions around the world. Each piece of documentation told the same story. The Parker Foundation was not a minor player in medical philanthropy, but one of the most significant private supporters of research and patient care in the country. Our funding had contributed to discoveries that had saved lives, improved treatment outcomes, and advanced scientific understanding in ways that would benefit patients for generations to come. But the most important documentation was the detailed record of our support for Nathan's specific research. I had requested comprehensive reports from every organization that had distributed Parker Foundation resources to his laboratory, creating a complete paper trail that demonstrated the scope and significance of our involvement in his work. The file I eventually assembled was 3 inches thick, containing grant agreements, equipment purchase orders, fellowship contracts, and financial reports that told the complete story of how the Parker Foundation had supported Nathan's transition, from promising graduate student to internationally recognized researcher. Every major milestone in his career could be traced back to resources we had provided, from his initial laboratory setup to the specialized equipment that had enabled his most recent breakthrough discoveries. I had also commissioned an independent assessment of Nathan's research impact, hiring a consulting firm that specialized in evaluating scientific contributions to analyze how his work compared to other researchers in his field. The report concluded that Nathan's immunotherapy research was among the most promising developments in cancer treatment in the past decade, with potential applications that could revolutionize how aggressive cancers were treated. But the report also noted that the quality and scope of Nathan's research had been made possible by access to equipment and resources that were typically available only to researchers at the most elite institutions with substantial private funding. The specialized instruments in his laboratory represented millions of dollars in investment, and the talent he had been able to attract as research assistants was directly related to the competitive salaries and prestigious fellowship opportunities that his funding had provided. In other words, while Nathan's scientific brilliance was undeniable, his ability to translate that brilliance into groundbreaking research had been directly enabled by the financial support the Parker Foundation had provided. Without our funding, he would still have been a talented researcher, but he might not have had access to the resources necessary to achieve the level of success that had made him a rising star in the medical community. Armed with this documentation, I had begun the delicate process of preparing for a potential public revelation of the Parker Foundation's role in medical research. I worked with our family's legal team to ensure that any disclosure would be handled appropriately, consulting with experts in nonprofit law to understand the implications of revealing previously anonymous donations. The lawyers had been surprisingly supportive of the idea, explaining that transparency about philanthropic giving was increasingly expected in the nonprofit sector, and that the Parker Foundation's commitment to anonymity, while admirable, was no longer legally required once grants had been awarded and research had been completed. They helped me prepare documentation that would satisfy regulatory requirements while presenting our foundation's work in the most professional and credible manner possible. I had also begun strategic conversations with key figures in the medical research community, carefully laying the groundwork for what would eventually become a more public relationship between the Parker Foundation and the institutions we supported. Dr. Whitfield had been particularly helpful in this process, introducing me to other research directors and department heads who could speak knowledgeably about the Foundation's impact on their work. These conversations had revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated during the years when we maintained strict anonymity. The Parker Foundation's support was not just financially significant, but also intellectually respected within the medical community. Researchers who had benefited from our funding spoke about the Foundation's sophisticated understanding of research priorities, our ability to identify promising projects before they received broader recognition, and our commitment to supporting work that addressed genuine medical needs rather than simply popular causes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh at the Mayo Clinic had mentioned during one conversation that Parker Foundation grants were considered among the most prestigious awards in medical research, not just because of their financial value, but because of the Foundation's reputation for supporting only the most innovative and impactful work. She explained that receiving Parker Foundation funding was often seen as validation, that a research project had genuine potential to advance medical knowledge and improve patient outcomes. This reputation had been built over decades of careful grant-making, with my grandfather and father developing relationships with leading researchers and medical institutions while maintaining the Foundation's commitment to anonymity. But it also meant that revealing our involvement in Nathan's research would carry weight within the medical community in ways that even I hadn't fully understood. The final element of my preparation had been psychological rather than practical. I had spent hours in therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Lawson, working through the complex emotions surrounding my decision to potentially reveal information that could fundamentally change my relationship with Nathan and his professional community. Dr. Lawson had helped me understand that my desire to expose Victoria Sterling's assumptions wasn't just about defending myself, but also about claiming credit for contributions that had been genuinely significant and deserving of recognition. She had also helped me prepare for the possibility that revealing the Parker Foundation's role in Nathan's research might create complications in our marriage. Nathan's reaction to learning that his wife had been secretly funding his work was impossible to predict, and there was a real possibility that he might feel manipulated or embarrassed rather than grateful for the support. But Dr. Lawson had also pointed out that my current situation was unsustainable, with Victoria Sterling's attacks becoming increasingly bold and damaging while I remained unable to defend myself without revealing information I wasn't prepared to share. Something had to change, either in terms of how I responded to Victoria's campaign or in terms of my willingness to maintain the Foundation's anonymity, regardless of personal cost. The charity gala had presented the perfect opportunity to resolve this conflict decisively. The event would bring together virtually everyone who mattered in Chicago's medical research community, including the researchers, administrators, and philanthropists whose opinions carried the most weight in Nathan's professional world. If I was going to reveal the Parker Foundation's role in medical research, this gathering would provide an audience capable of understanding and appreciating the significance of our contributions. I had spent the week before the gala assembling a comprehensive presentation package, selecting the most compelling documentation of the Foundation's work, and organizing it in a way that would be accessible to people who weren't familiar with our history. The leather portfolio in my purse contained carefully chosen examples of our impact, before and after photographs of research facilities we had funded, patient testimonials about treatments developed with our support, and academic papers acknowledging Parker Foundation contributions to breakthrough discoveries. But the centerpiece of the portfolio was the complete record of our support for Nathan's research, documented in a way that would be immediately comprehensible to anyone familiar with academic funding structures. Grant agreements, equipment invoices, and progress reports told the story of how a promising young researcher had been transformed into an internationally recognized leader in his field through access to resources that most scientists could only dream of having. Victoria Sterling had no idea what she was about to unleash with her latest attack on my character and motivations. She thought she was delivering a crushing blow to someone who had no way to fight back, someone whose only response would be embarrassment and retreat. Instead, she had just given me the perfect justification to reveal information that would not only vindicate my position in Nathan's life, but also establish me as one of the most significant supporters of medical research in the country. The portfolio felt heavy in my hands as I prepared to stand up from our table, weighted not just with paper and documentation, but with the knowledge that the next few minutes would fundamentally change how everyone in this room understood my place. In their world, Victoria Sterling was about to learn that assumptions based on prejudice and social positioning could be not just wrong, but spectacularly and publicly wrong. The woman she had dismissed as a gold digger was actually the financial foundation that had made some of the most important medical research of the past decade possible. And tonight, in front of Chicago's medical elite, that truth was finally going to be revealed. The leather portfolio felt warm against my fingers as I rose from my chair, the conversations around our table gradually fading into hushed anticipation. Victoria Sterling's champagne flute remained suspended halfway to her lips, her confident smirk beginning to waver as she realized that my response to her public humiliation wasn't going to follow the script she had written in her mind. The crystal chandeliers cast shifting patterns of light across the pristine white tablecloth as I moved with deliberate grace toward the center of our seating area, positioning myself where every guest at our table could see and hear clearly. Dr. Whitfield had stopped eating entirely, her fork resting against her plate as she watched this unexpected development with the sharp attention of someone who had witnessed countless academic power struggles, but sensed that this particular confrontation was going to be different. Nathan's face showed confusion mixed with growing concern, clearly unsure whether I was about to make the situation better or dramatically worse. The other guests at our table had adopted the carefully neutral expressions of people who found themselves unwilling witnesses to what appeared to be a personal conflict, but were too polite to simply leave. "Victoria," I said, my voice carrying across the immediate area with crystalline clarity, "you've raised such an interesting point about my background and my relationship to medical research funding. I think everyone here would benefit from a more complete understanding of my family's involvement in supporting scientific advancement." I opened the portfolio with movements that were deliberately measured, allowing the anticipation to build as I retrieved the first document from its carefully organized contents. The silence that followed was profound and electric, filled with the kind of tension that precedes revelations that will fundamentally alter relationships and reputations. Victoria's expression had shifted from confident superiority to something approaching wariness, though she clearly still believed that whatever I was about to reveal couldn't possibly challenge her carefully constructed narrative about my character and motivations. "I'd like to share some information about the Parker Foundation," I continued, holding up a document printed on official letterhead that bore the foundation's seal and my signature as director. "Perhaps some of you are familiar with our work in supporting medical research and advancing scientific knowledge." The recognition that flickered across several faces was immediate and telling, particularly Dr. Whitfield's sharp intake of breath as she processed the implications of what I had just revealed. Victoria's champagne flute finally completed its journey to her lips, but her swallow seemed forced and mechanical, as if her body was operating on autopilot while her mind struggled to process this unexpected development. The confident woman who had been delivering cutting remarks about my motivations and qualifications was beginning to realize that she might have significantly misjudged both my background and my ability to respond to her attacks. "The Parker Foundation," I explained, directing my words to the broader table but keeping my eyes fixed on Victoria, "was established by my grandfather 40 years ago with the specific mission of supporting innovative medical research that might otherwise lack adequate funding. Over the past 4 decades, we have contributed more than $200 million to research institutions, medical centers, and individual scientists working on breakthrough treatments and therapies. The number landed in the conversation like a depth charge, sending ripples of shock and recognition through the assembled guests. Dr. Whitfield's expression had transformed from professional curiosity to something approaching awe, clearly recognizing the significance of the Parker Foundation's contributions to the medical research community. Nathan's confusion had deepened, his eyes moving between me and the documents I held, as he tried to understand how his wife had suddenly become associated with one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in medical science. But it was Victoria's reaction that provided the most satisfaction. The woman who had spent months positioning herself as the sophisticated insider while dismissing me as an ignorant outsider was now staring at me with an expression that combined shock, disbelief, and the dawning realization that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Some of our recent contributions, I continued, retrieving additional documents from the portfolio, include the new pediatric cancer wing at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which has treated over 3,000 young patients in its first 2 years of operation. We funded the genetic therapy research at Johns Hopkins that led to breakthrough treatments for previously incurable hereditary diseases. The Parker Foundation established the fellowship program at Harvard Medical School that has trained 60 of the country's most promising young researchers. Each revelation built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of philanthropic influence that extended far beyond anything the other guests had imagined possible. I could see understanding dawning in their faces as they began to grasp not just the financial scope of the Foundation's work, but its intellectual significance within the medical research community. Nathan's expression had evolved from confusion to something approaching shock as he began to understand the implications of what I was revealing. His wife, the woman Victoria had dismissed as a gold digger who brought nothing to their relationship beyond her appearance, was apparently connected to funding sources that had shaped some of the most important medical research of the past several decades. "But I think you'll find our most relevant contribution," I said, retrieving the thick folder that contained documentation of the Foundation's support for Nathan's research, "has been our ongoing investment in immunotherapy research right here, in Chicago. Specifically, the work being conducted by Dr. Nathan Cross." The words hung in the air like a revelation that would reshape everything everyone at this table thought they knew about my marriage, my motivations, and my place in Nathan's professional world. Victoria's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her earlier confidence evaporating as she began to understand that the woman she had been publicly humiliating possessed resources and influence that dwarfed her own family's pharmaceutical fortune. The champagne flute in her hand trembled slightly, sending tiny ripples across the surface of the golden liquid. Nathan's reaction was immediate and visceral, his chair scraping against the floor as he turned to face me fully, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been betrayal. "Amanda, what are you talking about?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere that had settled over our table. I opened the folder and began extracting documents with the same deliberate precision I had used throughout this revelation, allowing each piece of evidence to speak for itself, rather than rushing through explanations that might diminish their impact. "The Parker Foundation has been supporting your research for the past 5 years, Nathan. The specialized equipment in your laboratory, the research assistants who have helped you achieve your breakthrough discoveries, the conference travel that has allowed you to share your work with the international medical community, all of it has been funded through carefully structured grants and donations from our foundation." The documentation told the story more effectively than any speech could have. Equipment purchase orders totaling nearly $2 million, detailed specifications for the flow cytometers and cell culture systems that were essential to Nathan's immunotherapy work. Grant agreements for research assistant salaries that had allowed him to attract the most talented graduate students in his field. fellowship contracts that had brought brilliant postdoctoral researchers to his laboratory from institutions around the world. Nathan reached for the documents with hands that weren't quite steady, his eyes scanning the familiar equipment listings and laboratory specifications, while his mind struggled to process how these resources had actually been funded. I could see the moment when recognition dawned, when he began to understand that his entire research infrastructure had been built on foundation support that had somehow remained invisible to him throughout years of scientific achievement. The National Medical Research Alliance, I explained, watching his eyes widen as he located that familiar funding source among the documents, is a subsidiary organization that we use to distribute resources to promising researchers. The Midwest Cancer Research Initiative that funded your laboratory expansion last year. That's another Parker Foundation program. The equipment grants that allowed you to purchase the specialized instruments that made your breakthrough possible. All Parker Foundation funding, carefully structured to appear as if it came from multiple sources. Victoria had set her champagne flute down with trembling fingers, her carefully manicured hands pressed flat against the white tablecloth as she struggled to maintain composure in the face of revelations that were systematically destroying every assumption she had made about my background and qualifications. The woman who had spent months positioning herself as Nathan's professional advocate was learning that she had been taking credit for facilitating research that was actually funded by the person she had been working to exclude from his professional circle. The total Parker Foundation investment in Nathan's research, I continued, retrieving the financial summary that had been prepared by our accounting firm, currently stands at $4.2 million. This funding has enabled discoveries that are already being implemented in clinical trials at major cancer centers, treatments that have the potential to save thousands of lives and represent genuinely revolutionary advances in how we approach aggressive cancers. The numbers were staggering by any measure, representing one of the largest ongoing research investments in the Foundation's history. But more than the financial magnitude, these figures demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of research priorities and scientific potential that had guided our funding decisions. The Parker Foundation hadn't simply written checks to support Nathan's work. We had identified his potential before the broader medical community recognized his significance and provided precisely the resources necessary to transform theoretical concepts into practical breakthroughs. Dr. Whitfield was studying the documents with the intense focus of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing, her expression reflecting both professional admiration for the Foundation's strategic approach to research funding and personal amazement at finding herself seated next to someone whose family had shaped the landscape of medical research in ways she was only now beginning to comprehend. "This is impossible," Victoria finally found her voice, though it lacked the confident authority that had characterized her earlier attacks. "Nathan's funding comes from government grants and institutional support. Everyone knows that. He's published papers acknowledging his funding sources, and none of them mention any Parker Foundation." I smiled at her objection, recognizing it as the desperate attempt of someone who is watching her carefully constructed worldview collapse in real time. "That's absolutely correct, Victoria. Nathan has never knowingly received Parker Foundation funding, because we've always believed that research should be evaluated on its scientific merit, rather than its relationship to donors. Our support has been carefully structured to preserve researcher independence while providing the resources necessary for breakthrough discoveries." Nathan was reading through the grant agreements with growing amazement, his finger tracing equipment specifications and funding amounts, while his understanding of his own career trajectory was fundamentally transformed. "Amanda, this means that everything I've accomplished, every discovery, every breakthrough, it was all made possible by funding from your family's foundation?" The question contained layers of emotion that I had been preparing for during months of therapy sessions and strategic planning. Nathan's scientific achievements were genuine and significant, the result of his brilliant mind and tireless dedication to advancing medical knowledge. But those achievements had been enabled by access to resources that were far beyond the reach of most researchers. resources that had been provided anonymously by the Foundation while he remained unaware of their true source. "Your discoveries are entirely your own," I assured him, recognizing the importance of addressing his concerns about the legitimacy of his scientific work. The Parker Foundation doesn't fund researchers in hopes of influencing their results or claiming credit for their achievements. We fund promising scientists because we believe their work has the potential to save lives and advance human knowledge. The breakthrough treatments you've developed, the innovative approaches you've pioneered, those emerged from your mind and your dedication. We simply provided the tools and resources that allowed your brilliance to flourish. Victoria was studying the assembled documentation with the desperate intensity of someone looking for any detail that might allow her to dismiss or minimize what she was seeing. But the evidence was comprehensive and irrefutable, bearing the official seals and signatures of institutions she recognized and respected. The Parker Foundation's support for Nathan's research was documented with the kind of meticulous precision that characterized serious philanthropic organizations rather than the casual charity work of wealthy dilettantes. "The irony of this evening," I said, turning my attention back to Victoria while Nathan continued processing the documents that were reshaping his understanding of his own career, "is that you've spent months positioning yourself as Nathan's professional advocate while systematically attacking the person whose family has actually been funding his work. You've taken credit for connecting him with research opportunities that were actually created by the Parker Foundation. You've dismissed me as someone who brings nothing to his career while I was quietly ensuring that he had access to resources that most scientists can only dream of having." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, supported by documentation that no one at the table could dispute. Victoria had indeed spent considerable time and energy building her reputation as someone who understood and supported important medical research, often by taking credit for opportunities and connections that had actually originated from sources she knew nothing about. Robert Hayes, who had remained silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke up with the careful tone of someone who recognized that he was witnessing a moment that would be discussed in Chicago's medical community for years to come. "Amanda, if I understand correctly, you're saying that the Parker Foundation has been anonymously funding Nathan's research for his entire career, and that Victoria has been taking credit for facilitating opportunities that your foundation actually created." The question crystallized the essential elements of what had just been revealed, stripping away the complex details of grant structures and funding mechanisms to focus on the fundamental issues of credit, influence, and the systematic misunderstanding of who had actually been supporting Nathan's scientific achievements. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Robert," I confirmed, maintaining eye contact with Victoria as I delivered what would be the final blow to her carefully constructed narrative about my character and motivations. Victoria has built her reputation in this community partly by claiming to support research that my family has actually been funding. She's positioned herself as an advocate for medical advancement while working to exclude the person whose foundation has contributed millions of dollars to the work she claims to champion. The silence that followed was profound and complete, broken only by the distant sounds of other conversations continuing at tables throughout the ballroom where guests remained unaware of the drama that was unfolding in our corner of the room. Victoria Sterling, the woman who had arrived at this gala with such confidence in her social position and influence, was now sitting in stunned silence as she processed the complete destruction of everything she thought she knew about my background and qualifications. Nathan was still studying the documents, his expression cycling through amazement, gratitude, and what appeared to be a growing sense of embarrassment about how his wife had been treated by people whose respect he had been seeking. The man who had allowed Victoria to attack my character and motivations was beginning to understand that he had been permitting someone to publicly humiliate the person whose family had made his entire career possible. Dr. Whitfield reached across the table with trembling fingers, touching one of the Parker Foundation documents as if she needed physical confirmation that what she was seeing was real. "Amanda, I had no idea. When you mentioned your family's foundation during our meeting, I understood that you represented significant philanthropic resources, but I never imagined that we were discussing the Parker Foundation. Your family's contributions to medical research have been legendary in our community for decades. Her words carried the weight of professional recognition from someone whose opinion mattered enormously in Chicago's medical research community. Dr. Whitfield wasn't simply being polite or diplomatic. She was acknowledging that the Parker Foundation's work had earned genuine respect and admiration from the people who understood its significance and impact. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I had no idea about any of this. If I had understood who you were, what your family had contributed, I never would have said those things. The words were an admission of defeat rather than a genuine apology, acknowledging that her attacks had been based on ignorance and assumption, rather than any actual knowledge of my background or qualifications. But her response also revealed the fundamental flaw in her thinking that had led to this moment of public humiliation. Victoria was apologizing not because she recognized that her behavior had been cruel and inappropriate, but because she had discovered that I possessed wealth and influence that exceeded her own. Her regret was based on social positioning rather than genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. The problem, Victoria, I said, maintaining the calm tone that had characterized this entire revelation, isn't that you didn't know about my family's foundation. The problem is that you made assumptions about my character and motivations based on nothing more than prejudice and social positioning. You decided that I was a gold digger without bothering to learn anything about my background, my qualifications, or my contributions to Nathan's life and career. The indictment was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through her attempted apology to expose the ugly assumptions that had motivated her months-long campaign against my reputation. Victoria Sterling had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of person who judged others based on superficial appearances and social hierarchies rather than actual knowledge or evidence. The transformation in how the other guests were looking at me was immediate and complete. Where there had been polite tolerance for Nathan's wife, there was now genuine respect for someone whose family had shaped the landscape of medical research. Where there had been questions about my qualifications to participate in serious conversations about scientific advancement, there was now recognition that I represented one of the most significant sources of research funding in the country. But perhaps most importantly, Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed reputation as a sophisticated advocate for medical research had been revealed as largely fictional, built on taking credit for opportunities she had never actually created, and dismissing people whose contributions she was too ignorant to recognize. The woman who had arrived at this gala, believing she held all the social and professional advantages, had just learned that assumptions based on privilege and prejudice could be not just wrong, but spectacularly and publicly wrong. And everyone at our table had witnessed the moment when her cruelty had finally met its match in the form of truth that could not be disputed or dismissed. The aftermath of my revelation rippled through the charity gala like seismic waves, transforming not just the dynamics at our table, but sending tremors throughout the entire ballroom as word of Victoria Sterling's spectacular miscalculation spread through Chicago's medical elite. Within 20 minutes of my presentation of the Parker Foundation documents, a steady stream of research directors, department heads, and pharmaceutical executives had made their way to our table, ostensibly to greet Dr. Whitfield, but clearly drawn by the growing buzz about the evening's unexpected developments. Victoria had excused herself shortly after my revelation, mumbling something about needing fresh air, while her face remained ashen beneath her carefully applied makeup. She never returned to the gala, and I later learned from mutual acquaintances that she had summoned her driver and departed the Meridian Hotel without speaking to anyone else. Her dramatic exit only amplified the story that was already spreading through the ballroom, with guests sharing whispered accounts of how the woman who had publicly accused Nathan Cross's wife of being a gold digger had discovered that her target was actually the heir to one of medical research's most legendary philanthropic fortunes. Nathan's response to learning about the Parker Foundation's role in his career had been complex and deeply emotional, cycling through amazement, gratitude, embarrassment, and what I recognized as a profound recalibration of how he understood our relationship. During the remainder of the gala, he remained close to my side with an attentiveness that was both protective and deferential, clearly still processing the magnitude of what had been revealed and its implications for everything he thought he knew about his professional success. "I need to understand something," he said during a brief moment when we found ourselves alone at our table, while the other guests mingled during the networking portion of the evening. "How long have you known about the Foundation's support for my research? When did you realize that your family was funding my work?" His questions were asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation, but I could hear the underlying concern about the timeline of our relationship and whether my romantic interest in him had been influenced by prior knowledge of his research potential. The question was one I had anticipated and prepared for during months of therapy sessions with Dr. Lawson, who had helped me understand the complex emotions that Nathan would likely experience upon learning about the Foundation's involvement in his career. "I first read about your research in academic journals before we ever met," I explained, choosing my words carefully to ensure he understood both the timeline and my motivations. "The Parker Foundation approved your initial equipment grant 2 years before you and I were introduced at that conference reception. My personal interest in you developed completely independently of my professional knowledge of your work." Nathan's relief was visible as he processed this information, clearly concerned that our entire relationship might have been built on hidden agendas or calculated deception. "But you must have realized the connection when we started dating seriously. You knew that the Foundation was supporting research that I believed was being funded through traditional academic channels." This was the more complicated part of the explanation, requiring me to help him understand the complex ethical considerations that had guided my decisions about disclosure throughout our relationship. I recognized the connection within a few months of us dating, but revealing it would have created impossible complications for both of us. You would have questioned whether every career opportunity was based on merit or marriage, and I would have been put in the position of having to navigate the intersection of personal and professional relationships in ways that could have compromised both. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Margaret Chen, the director of cancer research at University of Chicago, who approached our table with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated she had specific business to discuss. "Amanda," she said, extending her hand with warmth that was markedly different from the polite courtesy I had received from medical professionals earlier in the evening, "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I wanted to personally thank you for the Parker Foundation's support of our pediatric oncology program. The new treatment protocols we've developed with your funding have improved survival rates for children with aggressive brain tumors by 40%. Her words carried the weight of genuine gratitude mixed with professional respect, acknowledging not just the financial support, but the sophisticated understanding of research priorities that had guided the Foundation's funding decisions. "When I learned tonight that you were personally involved with the Foundation's work, I realized I needed to tell you directly how your family's support has translated into real lives saved, and families who still have their children because of treatments that wouldn't have been possible without Parker Foundation resources." These were the moments that made decades of philanthropic work meaningful, hearing directly from researchers about how Foundation funding had enabled discoveries that saved actual lives, rather than simply advancing abstract scientific knowledge. Dr. Chen's gratitude was particularly moving because pediatric cancer research often received less attention and funding than adult oncology, despite the devastating impact of childhood cancers on families and communities. Nathan listened to this exchange with growing understanding of the scope and significance of the Parker Foundation's work, clearly beginning to appreciate that my family's involvement in medical research extended far beyond his own laboratory and represented genuine contributions to advancing human knowledge and saving lives. The woman he had married possessed not just wealth, but also the kind of sophisticated understanding of scientific priorities that came from decades of involvement with cutting-edge research. The remainder of the evening brought a steady stream of similar interactions, with researchers and administrators approaching to express gratitude for Foundation support that had enabled everything from breakthrough discoveries to improved patient care facilities. Dr. James Morrison thanked me for funding that had allowed his team to develop new treatments for rare genetic disorders that affected fewer than 1,000 patients worldwide, but had previously received virtually no research attention. Dr. Sarah Kim described how Parker Foundation equipment donations had enabled her laboratory to conduct experiments that led to improved chemotherapy protocols with significantly reduced side effects. Each conversation reinforced the message that the Parker Foundation was not simply a wealthy family's charitable hobby, but a serious, respected player in medical research, whose funding decisions had contributed to genuine advances in treatment and patient care. The recognition and gratitude expressed by Chicago's medical elite demonstrated that my family had earned its reputation through sophisticated grant-making and strategic support, rather than simply writing large checks to popular causes. But perhaps the most significant development of the evening was the transformation in how Nathan's colleagues were treating both of us as a couple. Where there had been polite inclusion of the researcher's wife, there was now genuine respect for a partnership that represented both scientific brilliance and philanthropic influence. Conversations that had previously excluded me from technical discussions now included questions about my perspective on research priorities and funding strategies. Dr. Whitfield approached us near the end of the formal program with a proposal that would fundamentally change the Parker Foundation's relationship with the Northwestern Medical Research Institute. Amanda, I've been thinking about our conversation several months ago, and I wonder if you might consider making the Foundation's support more visible and collaborative. We have several promising research initiatives that could benefit enormously from the kind of strategic funding and long-term commitment that the Parker Foundation represents. Her suggestion represented exactly the kind of opportunity I had been hoping would emerge from tonight's revelation, a chance to transition from anonymous support to active partnership while maintaining the Foundation's commitment to advancing scientific knowledge rather than seeking recognition or control. I'd be very interested in discussing more formal collaboration, Dr. Whitfield. The Foundation has always believed that the best philanthropic relationships are built on shared commitment to advancing research rather than donor recognition. But there may be ways to structure partnerships that serve everyone's interests. Nathan's hand found mine under the table as we discussed potential future collaborations, his touch conveying both support for whatever decisions I made about the Foundation's public profile and gratitude for the years of anonymous support that had enabled his career achievements. The man who had been uncomfortable with Victoria Sterling's attacks on my character was now actively encouraging deeper involvement between his professional world and my family's philanthropic work. The drive home from the gala took place in comfortable silence, both of us processing the evening's dramatic developments and their implications for our future. Nathan finally spoke as we pulled into our driveway, his voice thoughtful and measured. I owe you an enormous apology, Amanda. I should have defended you against Victoria's attacks months ago, but I didn't understand the full picture of who you are and what you bring to our relationship. Tonight opened my eyes to how blind I've been to your contributions, not just to my career but to the entire medical research community. His apology was genuine and heartfelt, acknowledging not just his failure to defend me against Victoria's campaign, but his broader failure to recognize and appreciate the sophisticated understanding of his field that I had developed through years of involvement with the Parker Foundation. You don't need to apologize for not knowing about the Foundation's work, I assured him. Our commitment to anonymity was designed to prevent exactly the kind of complicated dynamics that we're going to have to navigate now that our support is public knowledge. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as news of the evening's revelations spread through Chicago's medical community and beyond. Victoria Sterling's social media presence went dark for nearly a month, and when she finally reappeared, at public events, her behavior was markedly more subdued and cautious. Several mutual acquaintances mentioned that she had been asking carefully worded questions about my background and the Parker Foundation's work, clearly trying to understand the full scope of her miscalculation. More significantly, the revelation of my connection to the Parker Foundation opened doors to collaborations and partnerships that had previously been impossible while maintaining anonymity. The University of Chicago invited me to join their medical research advisory board, recognizing that my understanding of funding priorities and research potential could contribute to their strategic planning. Northwestern offered to establish a formal Parker Foundation Center for Immunotherapy Research, providing Nathan with expanded laboratory facilities and resources while giving the foundation a visible platform for supporting innovative cancer treatments. The transformation in Nathan's professional relationships was equally dramatic. Colleagues who had previously treated him as a promising but relatively junior researcher now recognized him as someone with access to resources and support that placed him among the most influential scientists in his field. Conference invitations multiplied, collaboration opportunities expanded, and his opinions on research priorities were sought by institutions that had previously overlooked his work. But perhaps the most important change was in Nathan's understanding of our marriage and partnership. The man who had been oblivious to Victoria's systematic attacks on my character became fiercely protective of my reputation and contributions, publicly acknowledging the Parker Foundation's role in his research, achievements, and ensuring that my expertise in medical philanthropy was recognized and respected in professional settings. During one particularly memorable dinner party hosted by Dr. Whitfield 6 months after the gala, Nathan stood up to offer a toast that perfectly captured how our relationship had evolved. "I want to acknowledge someone whose contributions to medical research have been invisible for too long," he said, raising his glass toward me. "Amanda's family has supported scientific advancement for decades, and her personal understanding of research priorities has guided funding decisions that have saved countless lives. I'm incredibly fortunate to be married to someone whose commitment to advancing human knowledge matches my own, and whose family's foundation has made discoveries possible that might otherwise have remained theoretical concepts." The applause that followed his toast was genuine and sustained, reflecting the medical community's recognition that the Parker Foundation represented serious commitment to scientific advancement rather than casual charitable giving. But more importantly, Nathan's words demonstrated his evolution from someone who saw me as supportive spouse to someone who recognized me as an equal partner in advancing the medical research we both cared deeply about. Victoria Sterling eventually attempted to repair the damage from her spectacular misjudgment at the charity gala, reaching out through mutual friends to request a private meeting where she could offer a more comprehensive apology. I agreed to meet with her at a neutral location, curious about whether her regret was genuine or simply motivated by social damage control. The conversation that took place in a quiet corner of the Palmer House lobby was illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. Victoria's apology was thorough and appeared sincere, acknowledging that her attacks on my character had been based on assumptions and prejudices rather than any actual knowledge of my background or qualifications. "I was threatened by your relationship with Nathan," she admitted, "and I responded by trying to diminish your credibility rather than addressing my own insecurities. I understand now that your contributions to his career and to medical research generally have been substantial and sophisticated. But what struck me most about our conversation was Victoria's apparent genuine surprise at learning about the scope and significance of the Parker Foundation's work. Despite her family's involvement in pharmaceutical manufacturing and her supposed expertise in medical research funding, she had been genuinely unaware of one of the field's most respected philanthropic organizations. Her ignorance highlighted the gap between her claimed sophistication about medical research and her actual knowledge of how breakthrough discoveries were funded and supported. I accepted her apology while making it clear that our relationship would remain cordial but distant, recognizing that while people could learn from their mistakes, fundamental character flaws rarely changed dramatically. Victoria Sterling had revealed herself to be someone who made assumptions based on social positioning rather than evidence, And that kind of thinking was unlikely to disappear simply because she had been publicly embarrassed by its consequences. The charity gala had been intended as my formal introduction to Chicago's medical elite, an opportunity to finally gain acceptance in Nathan's professional world after years of feeling like an outsider. Instead, it became the venue for a complete transformation of my status from tolerated spouse to respected partner, from someone seeking approval to someone whose approval was sought by others. Most importantly, the evening demonstrated that assumptions based on appearances and social positioning could be not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong, capable of destroying reputations and relationships when they encountered truth that could not be disputed or dismissed. Victoria Sterling had learned that lesson in the most public and humiliating way possible, providing a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging others without bothering to understand their actual backgrounds or contributions. The Parker Foundation's transition from anonymous supporter to active partner in the medical research community opened new possibilities for advancing scientific knowledge while maintaining our core commitment to funding work that saved lives, rather than seeking recognition or control. Nathan's career flourished with the additional resources and visibility that came from acknowledged foundation support. But more importantly, our marriage evolved into a genuine partnership between equals who shared commitment to advancing human knowledge and improving patient care. The woman Victoria Sterling had dismissed as a gold digger had revealed herself to be someone whose family had contributed more to medical advancement than everyone in that ballroom combined, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person to underestimate is the one who appears to have the least power but actually holds all the cards. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.